me and Dr. Richard Ramchurn, my friend and colleague, created an experience over the course of about 4 years um, that is essentially a physiological adaptive virtual reality horror experience. So the way that it worked was that we have virtual reality. We then created a horror experience within that, used brain activity to measure an inference of fear from an individual in real time, and then use that fear from that individual to modulate the experience to scare them more or less. So that if someone wasn't scared enough, we scare them more, and if they're too scared, we scare them less. But before we go into any uh, detail on that, change the slide. It's not working for me. Let me try again. Might work. There we go. So Richard's going to talk about his work as AlbinoMosquito, the films that he's made in the past. Um, then I'll give a talk about the experience that I created, as well as kind of what led up to creating that kind of experience in the first place, and the more kind of research side of things. Richard will then go into his kind of partaking in the creation of it, and sort of how it all came together from your perspective as a director. And then I'll go on to, as a PhD, how I evaluated it, what I looked into, what interests I found from it, and the more kind of researchy side of things. So I will now pass over to Richard.
Yeah. Which button is it?
The arrow.
Arrow. Hi there. Hi. So yeah, Richard Ramchurn. I'm a researcher and artist, and my production company is called AlbinoMosquito Films. And for over 10 years, I've been writing and directing adaptive movies, so films that will change based on the viewer's physiological data a lot of the time to create like a unique filmic experience. These are the roster to date of my films. So I'm going to go through each one and a bit about like, how I work and how I create my movies. So The Disadvantages of Time Travel was the first film that I directed in this way. It's autobiographical piece about growing up in Scotland, but it's told as an experience that will edit based on your brain data. I was using an EEG device measuring attention and meditation, and it would use a spatial montage with meditation, and attention would cause cuts to happen. So actually existed in a lot of different ways. There was using hyperscanning with multiple participants throughout, and this was my first PhD project. Yeah, so I'm going to play a little clip of it, but it was we screened it in a little custom caravan that was turned into a cinema that we were able to take out and do tour it and do studies there. But yeah, let me play a little snippet.
There's a monster come to get you. There's a trick I could teach you. Just scrunch your eyes and look up into your head. It will wake you up.
So this film would like cut between or blend between like reality and dream worlds. So the main character would retreat from reality and in his dream world, and that was reflected in your brain data. So if you were shown more attention, then you would move to the reality world, and vice versa with meditation. The next film I made a few years later was called The Moment, which was a sci-fi thriller written in 2016. Like kind of looking at like the kind of rise of the far right that was happening at the time, and extrapolating that into the future with AI. So it's all still quite prescient. This film followed three characters, and it again used EEG as a way to basically cut between these three characters, and worked out there was something like I don't know, it was like billions of combinations that the film could be in. So when we screened it like several hundred times, and there was even as a director, I was seeing new combinations each time it was being screened. Yeah, so I'll play a little section of this.
It will set into motion something cannot be stopped. And whoever it is that's calling to me, if they need to or not, they will be destroyed like all the others. This time will be no different. I have to intervene. There are no more chances after this. So I am moving towards them with the speed that is obvious to anyone connected as I force my main network towards theirs, distorting all around me, bloating and disfiguring as I go, sending out tentacles ahead of me, and maybe I can get there in time.
So with the moment, basically every edit in the film was caused by attention peaks of the viewer. So that you ended up having, each person had their own unique rhythm of movie. And it was based on the idea of the cuts in films happen because you're taking in information. At one point you get something, or you understand what that shot's doing, and so your attention will peak, and then the next shot would happen. So then a few years later we got Before We Disappear, and this was like my response to like the climate crisis, and basically the billionaire class, and what their responsibilities are, like the fact that we are told that we've got a personal carbon footprint, but when you look at the richer individuals, like what their carbon footprint is. But again, sci-fi thriller. The main character creates an AI to define the a footprint of human suffering, and then target those individuals across the world who's got the highest footprint of human suffering, and then sends out a drone army to kill them all. Not that I condone that. And the actual film itself like explores like that main character's like guilt and what they're going through after the fact. So this film was used a computer vision algorithm on the viewers' faces, and it was it started off with images of climate change, and that first scene is like 15-20 seconds, and it takes uses the data from that scene to build and edit through off the rest of the film. And I'll play it.
How many people have you killed? Do you care? Do you even remember?
Then this takes us, I'm going to skip over A Place for Everyone, the film that we're going to talk about, or the VR experience we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about my most recent piece of work that I'm working on, which is called AI Lens, which is a filmmaking system that uses AI as a transformation to be used live on set. So as a filmmaker, or a camera operator, you've got your camera, and instead of the monitor showing the output, you've got an AI transformation, and it's and then I'm looking at how the crew, the DOP, the director, the actors, how they negotiate creating content in that space. And I've just shot my first film with it called Basilisk, which is almost complete. And I'm running a couple more commissions to work with filmmakers for them to tell their stories using this system. So I just got to talk a little bit about my working practice. I was the industry partner with Callum. So he came to me with an idea of making a horror VR experience. And my work is I write and direct scripted drama. And a lot of the time, the technology that I use to tell the story becomes intertwined with the actual with the telling of the story. It's quite self-reflexive in that way. And I do like to extrapolate technologies into the future, do speculative fiction. So this, after making Before We Disappear, the climate film that I just showed, I was still, I mean, at the time where there's a big, a lot of negativity towards refugee groups. And it was very obvious that with climate change, it's going to cause climate refugees. And so what I did is turned that idea on its head for a UK audience of creating British refugees within their own country, moving inland from the coastal areas, and to explore that idea. A lot of my work's talking about now, but just in a future context. Some of the themes of my work is externalizing inner narratives on the outside space, and having individuals navigating much larger worlds than what they're able to control. And I like to explore is meaningful change ever individualized? What does it take to make change in the world? And yeah, when individuals do take that on board, what's the ethical cost on themselves? I've been exploring the interactive effect of viewing narrative content and creating this two-way effect loop where the viewer changes what they're watching by how that content is affecting them. So making this closed loop system where it's not active conscious control, but more using the parasympathetic systems to affect what's happening. And again, it's self-reflexive on the actual technology we're using, exploring brain data with AI or stuff like that. So the world building that I made, a lot of my work is quite dystopic, but I approach it from a hopeful place. I think showing I was quite inspired by reading 1984 when I was a kid, and that idea of this. I think it's a way of giving people power to see what could go wrong to make action now. And I've been interested in AI since before LLMs were about, and talking about that in my work. So it's quite now with I work with AI Lens. I'm working hard to make a system that keeps the human in the room, that allows human filmmakers to continue doing that. Yeah, and then I think I'm going to hand over to Callum, who's going to talk about A Place for Everyone and how that came to be.
Cheers. Right, so I'm going to give a kind of snapshot of the PhD over the last, well, over the whole 4 years, I guess. Um, so I'll talk about kind of the motivation of the PhD in the first place. So with fear, when you watch horror films, you get quite a lot of mixed reviews from individuals who may not be scared, maybe too scared. You get a lot of people that don't like horror because they don't like this kind of like thrill-seeking idea. But I kind of liked the thought of creating something that you could kind of get everyone involved with. So if you're not a fear person, you could still watch it, and in theory, you would have a same level of fear or potentially less fear than someone who loves fear and wants to be pushed further. So the aim of it was that you could kind of set how scared you wanted to be in an experience ahead of time, so that you can then not be pushed too far and you can enjoy an experience without thinking that you can be absolutely terrified the whole way through. So I think horror is a great way of doing that. I think VR is a great medium for this as well. VR is kind of seen as a very kind of immersive medium, and I think VR horror was very prevalent kind of near the start of VR as a system. You see a lot of horror games. I mean, I think Phasmophobia is probably one of the ones that comes to mind first. But you get loads of VR horror that I think people are really interested in. Um, but horror being individual and fear being a very kind of subjective thing, we need to find a way in which that can affect everyone, or you can find a way that you can modulate for everyone. So that's where the PhD comes in. So positioning in the wider context. So I decided to kind of create a real-time emotion-driven VR horror experience. So looking into how can we make a generalized fear experience. So this is where horror's been around for a long time. There's been very many kind of generational changes in horror, the way in which we look at it. As I said, is very prevalent in virtual reality. And there are existing adaptation methods, but not really towards horror and fear. You kind of get some games that maybe tweak the audio slightly, or maybe make gameplay more difficult. But in terms of actually modulating in accordance to an emotion, um, although you cannot directly read emotions, you can infer from those. So that's what I tried to do here. And so I used a brain scanner called FNIRS, which is functional near infrared spectroscopy. So you have things like EEG, which reads electrical impulses in the brain. FNIRS looks at changes in oxygenation. So if you're scared, in theory, parts of your brain will receive more oxygen than other parts of the brain, and we can measure that. And then we can say, okay, in theory, if this part of the brain is receiving more oxygen than other parts of the brain, we infer that you're probably scared. So that's kind of where the measurement of fear came in. Um, so the research questions that I looked into, can we measure fear from FNIRS and can we use it in a real-time experience? How can we create these kinds of experiences and the narratives that modulate based on fear? How can media professionals utilize such a toolkit? So how can this be accessible to other people, especially those who want to create these kinds of experiences? And kind of what are the broader generalizations that can come from this kind of research? So methodologically, the process was understand fear from FNIRS, understand how people create horror films, create a horror film, and then evaluate it. So that's essentially what I did. I kind of had 4 studies overall throughout the whole PhD, kind of one per year, if you want to put it that way, but it never quite works that way. Um, so I think I have a slide for each one. So the first one I did was studying fear in FNIRS. So I developed, I think, 3 or 4 kind of fear video. I think I had 3 or 4 fear videos that were played to participants that were about 3 minutes long. And I also got participants to watch those in VR. So you watch a 3 minute long VR horror video in VR, and then you have a rest, and then you watch a calm video for 3 minutes, and then they alternate between the two. And the aim is that we can then look at the brain activity of people in a calm experience and of people in a fear experience and compare the two. The reason I chose fear and calm is fear, obviously, for the PhD, but calm is, I don't know if you've heard of Russell's circumplex model of affect, but essentially it maps kind of emotions on a graph of valence and arousal. So you have fear is seen as low valence, so kind of low mood, but high arousal, so high bodily excitement. And then you have calm, which is low arousal but higher valence. So you have 2 opposite ends of the graph. So if I can measure brain activity between the two, I can then look for significant differences in the two. And I found that it was the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which had high or significant activation in fear conditions as opposed to calm conditions. So I believe that's kind of just above your left eyebrow, kind of around here, which the brain scanner you can see here, one of the kind of lower left sensor modules lit up compared to calm when it was in a fear condition. So I had my example of fear and my way of measuring it. So in study two, I looked at interviewing horror filmmakers. I interviewed 7, Richard included, and did thematic analysis on this. So I asked them structured interview questions. I asked them what are the toolkits that they use when they create horror films, what's their motivations, what drives them. Um, and from that, I found 3 key themes. So dynamic storyboarding and creative flexibility. So a lot of them kind of they created this horror films based on their own kind of personal experience or their personal motivations. There wasn't a singular, I do it because I like scary things. It was just kind of like they have a lot of kind of feeling towards the horror that they create. Um, then there was directional coordination and processes. So this looked at kind of what kind of toolkits that they use, as well as managing the audience members' journey. So I asked them whether the audience journey was a significant part of them creating the experiences that they create. And generally it was a yes. There was some that just said they create films because that's just what they want to do. But other people create it because they want to get themes out there. As I think you explained, Richard, it's very much about getting certain themes out there. Um, but the key outcomes I had was that a lot of them were very interested in this idea of adaptation. You get a lot of kind of narrative changes. Some had explained, I think, like your work, Rich, is quite like narrative based in terms of reacting to the audience and the narrative changes. But they were quite interested in this idea of the environment changing around you rather than the narrative changing. So with my PhD, the narrative is the same for everyone. Everyone gets the exact same narrative, but it's the audio visual elements that change for the experience. So sound will change, the environment will change, textures might be different. There might be objects that change in real time in response to fear rather than the narrative changing. Um, so yeah. So I created a toolkit for adaptation. So this is where kind of like the real levers for the adaptive system come in. So from the horror filmmaker interviews, I found that they wanted a personalized toolkit for fear-based adaptation, and I made it in Unity because this is kind of where my expertise lie, but it also kind of worked well with the technology that we were using. Um, that would allow basically the content, the audio-visual content to be changed in real time. Um, Content modifiers in response to incoming inferred fear response. This is where the FNIS comes in. So the FNIS would come in, it would basically say, is this person scared or not? And then we would change stuff in real time. To set a baseline for each individual, the experience has a kind of a calibration phase right at the beginning of the experience, where someone will watch, I think it's 3 or 4 horror clips that are about a minute long, and FNIRs will be read on each one of those. And then you ask the participant which one best reflects the fear that you want to have in the experience. You then take the FNIRs kind of average data from that one clip, and that becomes the baseline. From then on, any FNIRs readings that come in are compared to that baseline. If it is above the baseline, the incoming fear, they're too scared, we reduce it. If it was under that baseline, they're not scared enough, we increase it. If they're roughly, I think it was 10% around that baseline, we keep them where they are. And so it's about a way of kind of modulating the fear that they have to keep them at like the threshold of fear that they were when they watched that horror clip that they wanted to have the experience be associated to. So I'm going to hand over to Richard again to talk more about the director processes of A Place for Everyone.
Thanks, Callum. Yeah. So, so I'm going to talk about the making of A Place for Everyone and how I came to this. So, we've got I'm at the VIP studio in Nottingham, the virtual and immersive production studio, where we have a lot of like really nice kit, motion capture, volumetric capture, things like that. So Our VolCap suite, I really saw the potential of making something, making a drama with that in VR. And this project came around just at the right time. At the time, I was exploring like AI, like 2022. I was exploring this idea of like climate collapse and visualizing that with AI, or looking beyond what life could be like after a climate collapse. And as this project kicked off, I think we got we got some funding to explore writing a script and creating a piece of work to take out to libraries and audiences in underprivileged areas. Uh, Part of the start of this project was like to take these images that I'd created of like these climate collapses made with AI, and this is like right at the beginning of, well, for me it was of AI diffusion models. It's like now looking at these images, they're like really crude. I still think they're better than half the stuff that's coming out now. But we took them to libraries and had people talking about basically having a imaginative discussions with these images as prompts. And we got some really rich discussions, and it was like quite emotional for some people. And we used that as like a starting point for writing a script. The project was quite a small team. I wrote and directed with Matt Johns, who's a filmmaker from Manchester. We had digital artist Shumit Sakar and Scrubber Fox, the musician. Yeah, and we had a cast of around 17 people, I think, finally. But yeah, so yeah, it's not a massive production, especially in the creative team, like probably larger with the cast. Um, but back to like when we're how we were making it. So like the research involved in writing something that was going to be that we wanted to be feel realistic for something that might happen. So we started talking to climate scientists at the University of Nottingham about like current climate predictions. Originally, we'd um, set this film like in the like way in the future, and they were like, no, actually bring it much closer to now. So I think it was like set in like 20, do you remember 2035? Yeah, I think it was 2035 because like, yeah, but anyway. The other influences were these three books that I'd been reading or read over the years, which tell like a really similar story and quite interesting. It's like this idea that this same story gets told, like it's been getting told for the past like what 70 years about like basically uh, climate journeys of like post collapse. Um, yeah, and yeah, so that became like kind of the holding narrative to like kind of to keep that that idea of like these refugees moving inland from the coastal cities. Um, so the narrative structure it's told from a point of view of like of way in the future looking back on this moment of climate collapse. You're in a museum and you can explore the experiences of people during this climate collapse. The narrative idea was in 10 years, everyone's got a chip in their head that records everything. And way in the future, they've dug up these chips and they're playing them back in a museum. There's six scenes. There is a narrative flow to them, but as a viewer, you can choose them and to watch them in any way you want. There's little plaques next to each of these memories, and you can be a bit of a detective and figure out, okay, these are the same people, or you can figure out the narrative flow through that. And then in the as we're building Schumett, the illustrator, he was coming up with like designs for costumes, doing previs for the world. Again, he's an illustrator, but he was like for experimenting with AI and how he could so the drawings on the left are his illustrations, and then on the right are like using those illustrations to try AI like versions of them. So we're experimenting a lot like of what different generative systems could help us with. And then we didn't use a lot of them. Maybe some textural tools, but here we go. But I'm going to talk a bit about like the actual physical making of the piece now. So as we're writing like the scenes, we're sketching out like what kind of environment would this be? Like what is the plan footprint of this space? Where do certain lines, where are they told? What does it look like? Where's the lights coming from? So we had these like sketches of the different scenes, and with volumetric capture, you don't need any sets. We're just capturing the bodies. So we would then set out in our studio like this plan, set the lights for where the sun's coming from, or through windows, or maybe bring in like reflectors for fires or such. So we used up to 8 RGB depth cameras, and for each scene we would basically with VolCap a lot of the time the standard configuration of cameras is in a circle, and you get all around a person. For this piece, you're pretty much static as a viewer. So we're basically building each camera configuration based on the actual action of the scene. We're doing so depth kit to Unity and then to VR as a workflow, and this meant that we could quite quickly take a capture and put it straight into VR, and then eyeball that capture from the point of view of the audience. And that another point was because you don't yeah, the closer you are to the cameras, the more detail you've got. So when you're capturing a bigger space, we're losing a lot of quality by having like a bigger volume space. So we're able to asynchronously capture scenes. So these are 2 shots from the same scene, but we're capturing it in 2 different days. And so we're able to even break up single performances by capturing, like, say, an entrance and then the actual spoken part separately. Where it was all recorded with ambisonic audio, as well as having clip mics on the actors, which worked really well. It was really effective sound wise, and using VolCap also meant we were able to change the scale of actors, which you usually wouldn't do in drama, but one of the scenes is told from a baby's perspective. And so we scaled up the performers like by like 1.5. And it was that image you saw of me looking up in VR, that was me looking to see if that would work as a scene. So right. Oh, and I'm going to show you a little snippet of it, of the film.
You said I can go to engineering?
Be a news item.
Engineering, that's really important, that, lad. You know, keeping all the lights on, all the machinery going. Oh, fucking well done, lad. Proud of you. Hey. Doing all right, you know?
Yeah.
Bad at all.
You think it could ever happen to us?
What?
Like, have we ever end up like them?
Oh, the fucking dirty craft.
Well, yeah.
Don't fucking think so.
Why would we end up like them? Did you say that?
Well, I probably never thought it'd go down like this for them, did they?
Listen, they're where they are, where they fucking belong. We're where we belong. Yeah?
Yeah, your dad's right. It's just the way it's worked out, though. Can't fix their problems, but can certainly fix ours, and that's all that matters.
Right.
So when we made it, we took it back out to those libraries and we toured it around like 4 or 5 different libraries in Nottingham, and then took it on a wider tour to film festivals across the country. So I think Callum's going to talk a bit more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, so now that we'd had the experience, we had it running, we tested it in libraries, we took it to, yeah, as Richard said, a few venues around the UK, as well as Italy, which was quite nice. So to evaluate the experience, I did 2 different kind of studies with it. One was in the wild, so that was going to the public, testing it on the public, getting their response, and I didn't really record any live brain data or anything else from these participants. This was just raw, what is their experience, how do they feel about this, and having an interview with them at the end. So of those people, 71% described the experience as horror, which is a good start. And actually 82% of people, of all of them, said that actually the adaptations, so the things that changed within the experience, increased the fear that they experienced, which is nice. And there's a nice quote here that says, I think the VR aspects of it actually contributes for me as to why it's horrific, because if you're embodying someone, you're in the experience, you feel very passive. So that kind of clarified for us that VR was the correct medium for us to choose. As for every experience, as Richard said, one of them you embody a baby, but there are other experiences where you embody different people, because we wanted the participant to feel like they were actually there in the experience, being involved with the narrative and the dialogue that was going on. For the second study, I went for a much more data-rich kind of set of data. So that involved collecting brain activity as well as galvanic skin response data. There were participants drew trajectories of their fear throughout each scene. And I also had each participant go through some scenes being adaptive, some scenes being not adaptive, and then some scenes being put to the highest level of fear from the get-go. And the aim of that was to see, was adaptation actually affecting the experience that they were having? So from that, 54% described the experience as horror, but 88% said they had increased fear from the adaptations that happened. And as I said, each participant for scenes had different conditions. So there was a no fear condition, a high fear condition, and then an adaptation condition. And overall, the adaptation condition did increase the prefrontal activity when talking about immersion and involvement. So essentially found that for the adaptive part of the experience, it did increase the immersion involvement that the participant had. So talking about the discussions and implications, technically, FNIS did work. Within the VR, it was a good kind of combination of the two. And a good further approach would be a multimodal approach, combining FNIS and VR, which to some is becoming a thing, but is very expensive and is quite hard to do. We've got just a front cap VR, so not a full cap VR. No, FNIS, sorry. Whereas wearing a full cap FNIS would be incredibly uncomfortable for a long period of time. So it would be good to embed FNIS into the VR headsets themselves. Then talking about individual subjectivity of fear, worked well, but required a calibration pipeline. So we needed to put people through a baseline calibration before we could just throw them into the experience. So then creativity and production. So I essentially developed a new tool for horror filmmakers to use, which is kind of detailed heavily in the PhD and the thesis itself. talking about adaptive horror can kind of redefine how horror is made. You can keep one of the things that filmmakers said they were worried about with adaptation is it affecting the narrative that they'd originally designed for the horror to take on. But the approach that I took just changed the audio-visual elements in an attempt to maintain the narrative as best as possible. And from the audience responses, I found that they found the adaptation didn't affect the narrative that they had. So that kind of hopefully helps with those issues that the filmmakers thought they would have. And AI could definitely have an impact on this in terms of the creation of audiovisual elements. So all of the whole experience that was created, there was no AI input other than I think a couple of textures that were made through AI, but no models or anything else were made. But I think you could, in theory, have a real-time AI model implemented into the adaptive system to then get more varied adaptations in the experience itself. Obviously, there would be issues with that ethically. If you have an AI that's pushing people too far with the adaptations that it's creating, you then obviously have to think about how far you want the AI to go. And there's ethics and social, so you've got the use of emotions for manipulation. So there are people that obviously don't want the idea of your emotion feeding back into an experience within a controlled environment like this. It's fine. But I think obviously if these things go further out, people are obviously wary of their own emotional data being used and things. So yeah, there are the risks around the use of emotion data for manipulations of experiences. So the contributions of my PhD overall. So yeah, the influences of fear can be detected with FNIRS and a horror VE, which is a virtual environment. So essentially, I found through FNIRS, horror can be read and used, or fear can be inferred and used. I created a horror filmmaker informed adaptive toolkit. So as detailed in the thesis, you can then go through and in theory, you could follow it along and create your own adaptive experiences from it. And I have a working adaptive experience that did increase fear, intensity, immersion, and involvement through adaptations. So there are a few limitations of the work. I think each of the studies that evaluated the experience had around between 20 and 30 participants. So it'd be great to get more. But the issue is that it takes about, depending, an hour to an hour and a half to run the whole experience and collect all the data. So it can take a while to do data collection. And as a PhD student, you're quite limited on time sometimes. So was limited there. But it'd be great to kind of look forward, have multi-sensor approaches. So add other physiological elements. So you can add heart rate to kind of add to the measurements of fear. You could use it in clinical and therapeutic uses. So this is talking about things like exposure therapy. If you can measure someone's fear level in something like exposure therapy, you could in theory adapt the therapy itself to fit the participant or the user more specifically. And as I said before, moving more towards kind of AI-driven adaptation stuff. So I think that's everything. Thank you for listening.
Is that coming through? Yes, it is. Brilliant. So yeah, thanks very much for an amazing talk. So now we've got a bit of time for questions. So people in the room, if you want to ask questions, stick your hand up. People online, tap your questions into the Q&A on, and then I'll pop over to the mic and read them out so everyone can hear them. But I think Aisha's first. I think.
Can you just talk a bit more about the calibration pipeline that you mentioned there? Like, was it part of the onboarding? How long did it take? What did it look like?
Yeah, so the calibration process was a series of 4 1-minute horror VR clips. So essentially, it was part of the onboarding process before they got into the experience or anything else. They knew obviously that they were doing the experience, but they hadn't done anything with it yet. So you sit them down, you get them to watch a 1-minute kind of VR horror clip. You then ask them afterwards how scary on a scale of 1 to 5 would you find this? Or it might have been 1 to 7. And they will then rate it. They will then rest for 30 seconds and then watch the next horror clip. And they'll go through all 4 and they'll rate each one. I then would get them to do it, I think, 2 more times with the same clips, just to make sure that any data I had coming through, if I had any dodgy data for one of the videos, I then had 2 backups to clarify that. I would collect I think it was the average peak of their brain activity over the 1 minute or the 30-second of that horror clip. And then at the end, I'd ask them, which horror clip of the four did you find the scariest? So let's say they found number two the scariest and they rated it, let's say 4 each time out of 5 or 7 or whatever it was. And I'd take the average of their FNIS data from that. That would be put into a place for everyone as their like baseline. And then any FNIS data that's read into the experience would be compared against that baseline. So in real time, if the baseline was 2 and the read in FNIS data was 3, for example, we know that what they're feeling right now is more brain activity than they were feeling in the calibration. And it's reading specifically the region that I found to respond to fear. So it implied that potentially they're feeling more fear right now than they were in the calibration, which is the kind of set of fear that they wanted to feel. So we're going to reduce the amount of adaptations that are happening right now. Does that make sense?
Brilliant. Did you have a question there, Phil? Did I see your hand?
Thank you. I was just writing down another question that I was listening to you, so I didn't forget it. Well, we'll stick with that one for the moment. Based on that, how far away or how much data do you think you would need to be able to get a general model of fear, as it were, so that you wouldn't have to do a calibration process? Or do you think, I'm just looking at the data you had, or do you even think there would be one? Did it indicate there might be?
Not anytime soon. So the reason I had the whole calibration process in the first place is because of how subjective fear is. And you not only have subjectivity in fear, but everyone's brain is very different. So the amount of brain activity that someone might get at the same level of fear as someone else could be a very different level of brain activity. So it's really difficult to create a generalized version of that. So I think there's probably research more into this than I did myself. I just used it as
okay,
I need to set a baseline for the experience, and this is a way of doing it. When I was doing research into this kind of process, there wasn't a huge amount that I saw. So it could be an interesting topic to look further into, but I think we're still a little way off having like a general approach to that. I think the calibration process is still very much required for something like this at the moment.
Okay. And had you considered the opposite use case in like a medtech type environment where if you use the same adaptation to try and calm someone down or to try and seek a different state, emotional state, do you think, or did you have any indication that this system could lead towards achieving that as well?
Yeah, so in the discussion, I think I talked about it, or wrote about it. So basically, the theory is that obviously if you can do it for fear, you could potentially look at other emotions as well. So then you can find brain activity responses to other emotions. And in theory, you could create, I don't know, more of like towards comedy, for example, looking for joy or happiness. That will obviously come with its own caveats of then having to create an experience that you think everyone will find funny or joyful in any way, shape, or form. So yes, I think it is possible. I focused on fear just because of the horror aspects and the work that Rich has done before. But I don't see why not that it could be used in other cases as well. In fact, I think the toolkit itself could also be used for other emotions, not just fear.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we have any online questions, Alan? Oh, brilliant. I'm going to read out a quick question there. So this is a question from Francesca. So they thank you for an interesting talk, and they say we've got a couple of questions for Callum. So affective states as high arousal might be interpreted as fear, but also excitement or panic. How could you know if fear was a positive experience or if the player didn't want that? So that's the first kind of question there.
Okay, so with the first study, I got a lot of subjective participant information as well. So after every single horror clip that they would watch and the calm clip that they watched in the first study I did, I asked them to rate their level of fear that they experienced or the level of calm. So to clarify whether what they were feeling was fear or calm. And then within the actual experience itself, when I got the richer data set, I got participants to map the trajectory of fear that they had throughout the experience. And Richard and I, before the adaptive experience was actually completed, we'd mapped out for every single scene what level of fear, like the trajectory of fear over the scene we expected the participants to have. Then when I got the participants to do it themselves and then I analyzed that, I found that actually the trajectories that the participants put for adaptive fear was almost the same as what we'd mapped it out to be. So although we could have been measuring excitement, different levels of arousal, the fear that we were getting was actually very close to the fear that we'd intended for the experience to have.
And there's a second part to the question, asking, saying that papers support that if you, many papers support that if you tell players and spectators there's an adaptation because of the placebo effect, they feel it's more immersive. So they're asking, were the people in your in your adaptation group aware they're in the adaptation group, and how did that affect the findings?
Yeah, so in the world, yes, they were aware. They watched the whole experience. It was adapted the whole way through. They were aware that it was an adaptive experience. For those that I got the richer data set in a more controlled environment, they were not aware that it was adaptive throughout all of it. So whether it was no fear, high fear, or an adaptive condition, they were unaware until the end of the experience. So all of the data that I got was, in theory, not affected by them having any idea because they didn't know, essentially. So
Brilliant. I think I might have seen a question from Helena here.
You just touched on it there, where you said you'd mapped out kind of where you expected the fear to take place. I wondered if, especially going back to the EEG, where you were talking about attention, you clearly did on quite a lot of people took part. I wondered if there were any surprises. Like, did it map against the expectations of somebody writing a screenplay for a, following narrative expectations? Did you get any surprises in your data?
So with the attention models that we did for the moment and the disadvantages of time travel, again, I wasn't recording any of the brain data, but as a person that made it and watching them back, I think the thing that stuck out for me is how the rhythms that were created were sympathetic to the person that was creating them, and they reported on that, and they were like saying it afterwards. Like, we had one guy who was said he was neurally atypical, and his version of his film cut faster than anyone I've ever seen, and everyone else in the room who watched it was like, "Whoa, that was a bit much," and he came out saying that was the best film ever. It was like amazing. So there was something there in terms of like what maybe it's placebo, and it's an intense thing, and I created that, but it felt like there was. Even when I watched it, I felt I got into a flow state where these edits were happening at the right moment when I was, and it was based on the research this guy called Cutting, who measured a neurological event and event segmentation in real life viewing, and basically, so say you pick up a cup and put it down, there's events within that there's a neurological peak, and what he described was that's one reason that edits can work, because if you cut at that neurological peak, you're ready for the next narrative cut shift. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the use of spatial audio and if there were any techniques that were particularly useful?
So we're using like a ambisonic mic. We set that up in the place where the viewer was going to be, but we also had radio mics and all the performers. So that would get mixed into the final mix, because we're finding that even though the spatial audio really is good for telling where people are, it's when somebody's like 5 feet away, picking up voices and that, it can get a bit muffled. And so we did do a final mix, and that there was a lot of back and forth between the sound designers mix our implementation into Unity and creating a mixer in Unity that would do some mixing in real time. Because there was also some adaptation with that audio mix. But I mean, more or less, it was as simple as like taking the ambisonic audio and putting it in a spatial audio object in Unity. I don't think we did anything very special with it.
Oh, yeah. Oh no, I don't want to take your mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't worry about that online.
I had a question around the cost of the system if you was going to scale and commercialize it, and obviously FNIRs can be quite expensive. But what approach would you take if you were planning to put this in? You said maybe we could put it in a headset. Say Meta wanted to include something like that in Quest 5. What approach would you take, and how low do you think the cost per unit could be?
Yeah.
So with FNIRs, it massively varies in the cost. So you can get there's certain brands, I think Mendy's one of them, that is around about anywhere between 600 and a grand, I think, per band. You get more medical grades. The one that we have here is an Octomon by Artenis, and I could be lying, but I think it's more towards the 5 to 10 grand kind of region. So I think if you were to integrate it into VR, you'd be looking much more at the lower cost, more consumer ready kind of FNIRs bands, with the rough price of about £500 for like an average VR headset. You could probably commercialize it between 1.5 to 2 grand, at a guess. I think there are companies looking at, I'm pretty sure there's EEG in some VR headsets already. Not entirely sure how expensive those are, but I'd imagine that they've also integrated other sensors into them as well. So I would imagine it's within the few thousands. So I think you're probably looking at roughly around the or below the 5 grand mark, if I had to guess. But I think if you find that there are certain regions of the brain that are worth measuring and are more impactful towards kind of VR immersion or VR gaming, you'd probably focus sensors on specific regions of the brain rather than necessarily having a VR headset that has a full cap. So in my case, if I wanted a VR headset that was specific to fear, I'd measure that one spot. That's only one sensor. I might maybe add in a few more just to get a bit more information, but realistically that could probably be cheaper than having one that maybe measures more. So it depends on the kind of spatial resolution that you're looking for. Obviously, the more spatial resolution you're looking for, the more expensive. But I'd estimate maybe between 2 and 5 grand, but that's very much a guess.
Cool, thank you.
A quick follow-up on that, actually. I'm thinking, so within it, my naive understanding of an FNIR sensor is kind of essentially a reversing sensor in a car. So an infrared emitter and receiver. Is actually the cost not the is the difference between the expensive and cheap headsets not the hardware perhaps, but the kind of software licensing for the software that is able to do that processing in a reliable way, and therefore maybe suggest that the scalability could actually happen at scale because it's not the actual hardware? Or am I missing? I don't know. That's a very naive understanding.
No, I think you're right. I think a lot of the time the cost comes from the software. So we've got OxySoft with that, and I would imagine that the actual band itself, technology-wise, isn't anything, insanely out there. And it will be the OxySoft software that will be the expensive part because it allows us to get the raw data and analyze it and do everything we need to as researchers. But obviously, if you're using one for things like, more commercial use, you don't need the raw data because that should all be done within, I don't know, the game or the system. So in theory, it could be cheaper. Obviously, I guess the designers need access to that data. So you need to have some way of getting it, but maybe there's a way commercially that obviously people can then buy without having to put any towards the actual licensing costs, and then the developers would then get access to that information some other way. So I feel like it probably would be more scalable.
I think we're coming to the end of time, but I don't know if there's anyone got a last question they'd like to ask in the room. Oh, one online, brilliant. Ooh, so we have a question here from an anonymous attendee asking, have you looked at the possibilities for a game using the technology?
I'd like to. I do very much think it could work. If it worked for a VR experience that's more kind of film based, I believe it could very much work for a game as well. Typically, if you took a horror game, you took a haunted house, you could walk through that house and you could have things changed based on your response to what you're seeing. So let's say that you could potentially make it pick up on, you have a few kind of key fear objects throughout the house. So let's say you might have some spiders in there, you might have kind of clowns, you might have ghosts, and then you can see how people respond to each one. And then you could, in theory, attune that game that you're playing to include whatever the object is that you're responding more to. So it could be that spiders is the thing that you don't like. So you could have the game potentially tweak and increase the amount of spiders that are in and that are happening throughout the game itself. So yeah, very much so. I think it could definitely work for a game.
Brilliant.